Welcome to Sound, your sanctuary for epic storytelling, where history comes alive through calm narration and timeless tales. Today, we journey deep into the sands of time to uncover the full, majestic saga of ancient Egypt, a land of pharaohs, pyramids, gods, and greatness. From the first tribes along the Nile to the last flickers of Egyptian sovereignty under foreign rule, this is the entire story, told like never before. But before we sail down this ancient river of time, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more immersive historical deep dives, and drop a comment below. Let us know where you're listening from, or what topic you'd love to explore in the next video, whether it's the Roman Empire, the rise of the samurai, or the secrets of the Maya. We read every comment, and your input helps shape our next adventure. So, get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, and let's journey to the land of the Nile. This is the entire story of ancient Egypt. Chapter 1, Before the Pharaohs, the Nile, the Desert, and the Dawn of Civilization. In the vast theater of Earth's ancient past, there are places where geography becomes destiny. One such place is the Nile Valley, a narrow corridor of life carved through an unforgiving desert landscape. Here, the longest river in the world flows not with mere water, but with the bloodline of a civilization destined to endure for over 3 millennia. It was along these life-giving banks that ancient Egypt was born, not in sudden brilliance, but slowly, patiently, across thousands of years, shaped by wind and silt, sun and flood, sky and earth. Between 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, the Sahara was not yet the barren desert we know today. It was a region of grasslands and savannas teeming with wildlife. Nomadic hunter-gatherers roamed this semi-arid Eden, tracking game, harvesting wild grains, and painting animals and gods on rock faces that still whisper of their presence. But around 7000 BCE, the climate began to shift. Rainfall dwindled, vegetation receded, and the once lush savanna began its slow transformation into a hostile sea of sand. Driven by ecological necessity, these early peoples began migrating toward a singular ribbon of promise, the Nile. Here, in a narrow belt that stretched from the Ethiopian highlands to the Mediterranean Sea, the land remained fertile, seasonally revived by the annual inundation of the river. Every summer, monsoonal rains in Central Africa swelled the Nile, sending its waters surging northward. As the floodwaters receded in autumn, they left behind a layer of dark, rich silt, a gift of unimaginable value in an otherwise sterile landscape. To the early settlers, this rhythmic flood was more than an ecological event, it was a miracle. It shaped their understanding of time, divinity, and cosmic order. In this world, life and death were not opposites but parts of a single eternal cycle, echoed in the rise and fall of the river, the sowing of seeds, and the return of the harvest. It was a worldview that would echo throughout Egypt's history, embedded into its theology, its art, and its architecture. By 600 BCE, early Neolithic communities had taken root along the Nile, forming small villages and practicing rudimentary forms of agriculture. They cultivated barley and emmer wheat, raised cattle and sheep, and fashioned tools from polished stone. Pottery, smooth, red-slipped, and often decorated with geometric designs, began to appear, marking one of the earliest signatures of cultural identity. These were not the Egyptians of the pyramids or the painted tombs, but they were their ancestors, laying the groundwork for what would become a world empire. Their lives were simple, cyclical, and intimately tied to the land. Yet even in these humble beginnings, one can detect the stirrings of what would become the hallmarks of Egyptian civilization: communal organization, spiritual ritual, a respect for cosmic cycles, and a slow but deliberate march toward centralization. Chapter 2. The Proto-Egyptians and the Seeds of Culture. As the centuries passed, the scattered villages along the Nile began to grow in complexity. By 5000 BCE, regional cultures began to emerge, not unified yet, but increasingly distinct. Archaeologists categorize this period into various phases: the Fayumé culture in Lower Egypt, and in Upper Egypt, the Badarian culture, one of the earliest known pre-dynastic civilizations. The Badarians were pioneers in agriculture and animal domestication. Their graves reveal bodies buried with care, accompanied by pottery, ivory combs, and personal ornaments, indicating an early belief in an afterlife. They were among the first to work with copper, a precious step in the slow march from stone to metal. By 4000 BCE, two powerful cultures had risen in the Nile Valley, the Naqada culture in Upper Egypt and the Mahdi culture in Lower Egypt. Naqada, in particular, would come to dominate the proto-historical scene. Its people built more permanent structures, developed intricate burial customs, and crafted some of the most refined pottery of the prehistoric world. They also began using symbols to identify property and individuals, perhaps the very first glimmers of hieroglyphic writing. Trade flourished in these centuries. The Nile became a highway for goods and ideas. Obsidian from Ethiopia, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, all passed through Egyptian hands. Maritime contact with Canaan and Mesopotamia introduced new techniques in metallurgy, weaving, and administration. Even more profoundly, religion began to crystallize. The Naqada people buried their dead on the west bank of the Nile, the land of the setting sun, a tradition that would endure for millennia. They adorned graves with amulets, figurines, and cosmetic jars, signaling a belief in personal preservation beyond death. Deities such as Horus, the falcon sky god, and Seth, the god of chaos and desert, began to take shape. There were gods in every corner of the land, Sobek in the marshes, Hathor in the cow and sky, Min in the fertility of the soil. Egyptian religion did not yet have a canon, but it had a soul, and it was deeply animistic, ritualistic, and reverent. The spiritual world and the material world were never truly separate in Egypt. The gods were not remote, abstract entities. They were present in the Nile, in the sun, in the animals, in the very breath of life. And they would soon be united under the banner of kingship. Chapter 3, The Dual Kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. By 3500 BCE, Egypt was no longer merely a chain of riverine villages. It had become a land of regional powers. The fertile delta in the north, known as Lower Egypt, was a network of waterways and papyrus marshes. Its people built towns of mud brick, fished the Nile, and traded with Mediterranean neighbors. Upper Egypt, to the south, was more arid and mountainous. Its people were miners, farmers, and warriors. They cultivated powerful symbols, the white crown, the lotus, and the falcon of Horus. They also built proto-cities like Hierakonpolis, Nekhen, Naqada, and Abydos, centers of trade, worship, and emerging governance. Tensions rose as competition for land, resources, and trade intensified. Regional chieftains, proto-kings, began to consolidate power. In Upper Egypt, one leader began to rise above the rest, Scorpion I, known from ceremonial maceheads found in Hierakonpolis, and his successors began expanding their control northward. This slow process of conquest and assimilation culminated in a single momentous act, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, traditionally dated to around 3100 BCE. The man credited with this monumental achievement was Narmer. His legacy is immortalized on the Narmer palette, a triumphal slab of siltstone discovered in Hierakonpolis. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt and smites a northern foe, on the other, he dons the red crown of Lower Egypt, presiding over decapitated enemies. Above him hovers the falcon of Horus, gripping a bound enemy by a reed marsh, the symbol of the delta. This is not mere propaganda, it is the beginning of history. For the first time, Egypt is a single land, under a single ruler, ruled not by man alone, but by a divine monarch ordained by the gods. Narmer, or possibly his successor Menes, founded the first dynasty and established Memphis as a political and administrative capital, a city strategically located at the throat of Egypt, where Upper and Lower met. With unification came a new political order, a religious synthesis, and an artistic style that would define Egypt for centuries. The king became the axis of the cosmos, the human guarantor of Ma'at, the sacred order that held the universe together. It was now his divine duty to uphold justice, conduct rituals, feed the gods, command armies, and ensure the annual flood. This was not kingship, it was godship. And it would endure, with only rare interruptions, for the next 3,000 years. Chapter 4: The Rise of Divine Kingship and the Age of Monuments. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was not merely a political event, it was a cosmic alignment. With the creation of a centralized state under a divine king came the birth of Egypt's first true civilization. And with it arose a new age, often called the Old Kingdom, though to the Egyptians it was the Zep Tepi, the first time, the golden age of creation, when kings reigned as gods and the world was young. This era, spanning from the 3rd dynasty through the 6th, saw the flowering of Egyptian culture in all its glory. Architecture, administration, religion, art, and engineering reached levels of refinement that astonished even later generations. It was during this time that Egypt built its most iconic structures, the pyramids. But the Pyramid Age did not begin with Giza. It began with a man named Djoser and his brilliant architect Imhotep. Chapter 5: Djoser and Imhotep, Builders of Eternity. Pharaoh Djoser, the second ruler of the 3rd dynasty, was a visionary. Unlike his predecessors who built simple mastaba tombs of mud brick, Djoser desired something grander, a monument that would pierce the sky, a stairway to the gods. He turned to a polymath named Imhotep, a genius of unmatched intellect who would become a legend. Architect, high priest, physician, scribe, and astronomer, Imhotep was the first commoner in history to be deified after death. He would later be worshipped as the god of wisdom and healing. At Saqqara, Imhotep conceived and constructed the Step Pyramid, the earliest colossal stone building in history. Rising in 6 tiers, it was more than just a tomb, it was an architectural revolution. The entire complex was encircled by a massive limestone wall and included courtyards, temples, and ceremonial structures. It was a symbolic recreation of the palace and cosmos, a city for the king to inhabit in the afterlife. For the Egyptians, this was not a metaphor. They believed that the king would ascend to the heavens and live among the gods, and so his tomb had to be not only grand but divine. Djoser's Step Pyramid was a declaration. Stone was now the medium of immortality, and the king's body, soul, ka, and legacy would endure for eternity. This concept, the eternal kingship embedded in monumental stone, would become the ideological and artistic foundation of the Old Kingdom. Chapter 6: The 4th Dynasty, the Zenith of Pyramid Building. Following the architectural triumph at Saqqara, the 4th Dynasty took pyramid building to unprecedented heights, both figuratively and literally. This was the age of the Great Pyramid Builders, a lineage of pharaohs whose monuments would dominate the Giza Plateau and the imagination of humanity for millennia. Sneferu, the father of engineering. The dynasty began with Sneferu, a king of ambition and innovation. He built not 1 but 3 pyramids, refining the form with each iteration. His first attempt, the Midam Pyramid, collapsed mid-construction. Undeterred, he commissioned the Bent Pyramid at Dahshur, which was built with steep sides that suddenly shift angle midway, a reflection of engineering adjustments made to prevent collapse. Finally, Sneferu built the Red Pyramid, named for its reddish limestone. It was the first true smooth-sided pyramid in history and stood as a testament to Egypt's evolving technological prowess. Sneferu's architectural journey laid the blueprint for all future pyramids and reflected the spirit of the age. A fusion of religious devotion, centralized power, and engineering excellence. Sneferu was beloved. He is remembered in folk tales as a just and kind king, even centuries after his death, a rare honor among pharaohs. His reign was prosperous, his campaigns expanded Egypt's borders, and his construction projects stimulated the economy, employing thousands. Khufu and the Great Pyramid of Giza. Sneferu's son Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, would immortalize his name with the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest and most mathematically precise stone structure ever built by man. Completed around 2560 BCE, the Great Pyramid originally stood 146.6 meters tall and was composed of over 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. The precision of its alignment, nearly perfectly oriented to the cardinal points, has inspired awe and speculation for centuries. Though later sources paint Khufu as a tyrant, the grandeur of his pyramid indicates a ruler of immense power and vision. The pyramid was part of a larger complex that included mortuary temples, smaller pyramids for queens, and the iconic Great Sphinx, possibly carved during the reign of his son, Khafre. The construction of such monuments required a vast, centralized administration. Contrary to popular belief, the pyramids were not built by slaves, but by a highly organized labor force composed of well-fed, skilled workers who lived in nearby villages with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. This was not merely construction, it was statecraft, theology, and national identity carved into stone. Chapter 7: Divine Order and Bureaucratic Precision. The pyramids were not just tombs, they were symbols of Ma'at, the divine order. The king, as the earthly embodiment of the god Horus, maintained this balance through his rule, his rituals, and his building projects. To govern an increasingly complex state, the Old Kingdom developed a sophisticated bureaucracy. The central government was staffed with scribes, priests, treasurers, viziers, and provincial governors called nomarchs. These officials recorded taxes, oversaw irrigation, coordinated temple rituals, and managed the distribution of food and labor. The heart of this administration was the vizier, the highest official beneath the pharaoh. The vizier controlled the legal system, land surveys, building projects, and the census. From Thebes to the Delta, Egypt was divided into nomes, each overseen by a nomarch who served both as regional administrator and priest. The state also oversaw vast agricultural estates, mines in the Sinai, quarries in the eastern desert, and trade expeditions to Lebanon for cedar, punt, likely modern-day Eritrea or Somalia, for incense and myrrh, and Nubia for gold. Religion permeated every facet of life. Temples were centers of both worship and administration. Priests performed daily rituals to awaken, feed, and clothe the god statues, believed to house divine essence. Ritual purity, sacred calendars, astronomical alignment, and magical spells were all part of the Egyptian worldview. The afterlife was not a distant paradise, it was a continuation of life on earth, requiring preservation of the body, provision of offerings, and invocation of sacred texts like the Pyramid texts, first inscribed in the 5th dynasty. Chapter 8: The 5th and 6th Dynasties, Spiritual Transformation and Decentralization. As the Old Kingdom progressed into its 5th and 6th dynasties, the religious landscape began to evolve. The rise of Ra, the sun god, became central to royal theology. Pharaohs now called themselves sons of Ra, and built sun temples to honor him, particularly at Abu Sir. The Pyramid texts, a corpus of incantations and funerary spells, first appeared in the Pyramid of Unas, the last king of the 5th dynasty. These texts reveal a deepening concern with the afterlife and the pharaoh's journey to the heavens, often via the celestial ladder of stars or through transformation into a divine being. Yet even as religious complexity deepened, political cracks began to appear. In the 6th dynasty, under Pharaoh Pepi I and his successors, the central authority of the king began to wane. Nomarchs increasingly wielded hereditary power, and the long reign of Pepi II, lasting over 90 years, led to a stagnation of royal power. By the end of his rule, the administrative machinery had grown bloated, regional leaders had become semi-autonomous, and the once mighty central government faltered. A combination of factors led to the decline: prolonged droughts that disrupted the Nile flood cycle, economic strain from overextended building projects, and increasing local rivalries. By 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom collapsed into a period of fragmentation and chaos known as the First Intermediate Period. Chapter 9: Legacy of the Old Kingdom. Though it ended in decline, the Old Kingdom's legacy would endure forever. The ideals of divine kingship, centralized bureaucracy, monumental architecture, and cosmic order became eternal cornerstones of Egyptian identity. Later pharaohs, even in the New Kingdom 1,000 years later, looked back upon the Pyramid Age with reverence. The pyramids themselves, silent, immovable, monumental, stood not just as tombs, but as symbols of civilization itself. They declared to all who saw them that here, in this land of sand and river, man had touched the heavens and made stone eternal. And yet, Egypt was not done. It would rise again, fragmented, then reborn. The story of ancient Egypt was only just beginning. Chapter 10, The Shattering of the Divine Order, the First Intermediate Period. The twilight of the Old Kingdom left behind not only fallen pyramids and exhausted coffers but a fractured society. When Pepi II, the last great ruler of the 6th dynasty, died after a reign that may have lasted over 90 years, Egypt was poised on the brink of collapse. The once unassailable belief in the divine and eternal pharaoh was eroding. No clear heir followed Pepi II, and what emerged was an epoch of confusion, regionalism, and localized power. The First Intermediate Period, a time the Egyptians themselves would later describe as one of darkness and disintegration. Decline and collapse, the fall of the Old Kingdom, the erosion of centralized control had been long in the making. During the latter part of the Old Kingdom, provincial governors, known as nomarchs, had grown in wealth and influence. Once appointed by the central government, these local lords began to make their positions hereditary. As central authority waned, these regional leaders transformed into de facto rulers of their territories. They collected taxes, maintained armies, and even commissioned their own tombs in styles that mimicked the pharaohs. Environmental crises compounded political weakness. The Nile floods, lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture, became erratic and insufficient. Years of low inundations led to widespread famine. Without grain, the state could not feed its people or pay its officials. Records from this era, including the bleak admonitions of Epure, tell of cities without governance, plundered tombs, and societal inversion. The poor man has become rich, and the rich man has become poor. In the absence of a strong pharaoh, two primary powers arose, the Heracleopolitan kings in the north and the Theban warlords in the south. Each claimed legitimacy, each saw itself as the rightful unifier of Egypt. What followed was not merely civil strife, but a struggle to redefine what it meant to be Egyptian in an era when the gods seemed silent. Chapter 11, The Dual Thrones, Heracleopolis versus Thebes. The House of Heracleopolis, from their capital at Heracleopolis Magna, located near the southern edge of the Fayum, the rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties maintained a fragile dominance over northern Egypt. These kings tried to preserve traditions of kingship, using Old Kingdom titles, commissioning modest tombs, and upholding religious rites, but lacked the grandeur and resources of their Memphite predecessors. Their rule was constantly challenged by rival nomarchs and the rising southern forces in Thebes. Though Heracleopolitan kings such as Kati III were known for acts of wisdom and administration, as seen in texts like the Instruction of King Kati, their control barely extended beyond the Delta and Middle Egypt. Interestingly, these northern rulers are also credited with literary contributions that reflect the psychological landscape of a splintered Egypt. In this period, we find early forms of wisdom literature, meditations on justice, kingship, and human suffering, including texts that later become part of Egypt's canonical moral philosophy. The Rise of Thebes and the Warrior in Tefs. Meanwhile, in the city of Wazit, Thebes, a line of local governors took a bold step. They began calling themselves kings. These Theban rulers, beginning with Intef the Elder and followed by his sons Intef I, II, and III, initiated a slow but determined campaign of expansion northward. These early Theban kings were buried at Dra Abu el-Naga, their tombs modest compared to the grand pyramids of the north but symbolically powerful in their connection to the sacred Theban necropolis. They began aligning their rule with the cult of Ammonius, a relatively minor god at the time who would soon rise to unparalleled prominence. This alliance between political power and priestly authority laid the foundation for Thebes' future dominance. By the time of Mentuhotep II, Theban forces had become well organized and militarized. He launched a decisive campaign against Heracleopolis, defeating the northern kings and establishing a single line of rule for the first time in over a century. Chapter 12: The Dawn of the Middle Kingdom. With the unification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II around 2055 BCE, a new era began, the Middle Kingdom. This was a deliberate reconstitution of Egyptian identity, an ideological and administrative rebirth following decades of turmoil. Mentuhotep took the title, "He who unites the two lands," echoing the earliest kings of Egypt, and declared a new divine mandate. The mortuary temple of Mentuhotep II at Deir el-Bahari. Mentuhotep II's most iconic contribution was his mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, nestled in the cliffs on the west bank of Thebes. Unlike the classic pyramid temples of the Old Kingdom, this structure was integrated into the natural landscape. It featured colonnaded terraces, a processional way, and shrines dedicated to deities such as Hathor and Anubis. It not only signaled architectural innovation but also a deeper theological expression. A merging of the earthly and divine through landscape. This temple would later inspire Hatshepsut's more famous structure at the same site, but its symbolic resonance began here. Egypt was reborn, not through brute monuments but through harmony with nature, piety, and divine kingship restored. Administrative reforms and cultural revival. Mentuhotep II and his successors undertook significant recentralization. They restructured the provinces, reinstated royal oversight of the nomarchs, and re-established trade routes to Nubia, Punt, Byblos, and the Sinai. The old bureaucratic machine was rebuilt with new efficiency. Artistic styles became more realistic, even austere, reflecting a sober awareness of mortality and the state's fragility. In literature, the Middle Kingdom blossomed. Tales such as The Story of Sinuhe and The Eloquent Peasant offered rich narratives exploring loyalty, justice, and moral ambiguity, humanistic themes seldom seen in earlier periods. These works remain some of the greatest masterpieces of Egyptian literature. Chapter 13: The 12th Dynasty, Egypt Reforged. Amenemhat I and the Co-Regency Tradition. The 12th dynasty began with Amenemhat I, a vizier who likely seized the throne through political maneuvering. Understanding the instability of succession, he established the co-regency system, where the pharaoh would appoint his heir as co-ruler during his own lifetime, ensuring continuity and averting power struggles. He moved the capital to Ichtoi, near the entrance to the Fayum oasis. This was both practical, proximity to trade routes and fertile land, and symbolic, representing a new seat of balance between north and south. Amenemhat I was also the author of The Instruction of Amenemhat, a political testament in which he warned his son about the dangers of betrayal, suggesting his own death may have come through conspiracy. Senusret I and the Rise of Ammonius. Amenemhat's son, Senusret I, was a powerful and effective ruler who continued his father's work. He expanded Egypt's southern frontier deep into Nubia, building fortresses like Semna and Buhan to protect trade and assert control. He also elevated the Ammonius priesthood, constructing major temples at Karnak, sowing the seeds for Ammonius' rise as Egypt's principal deity. His reign brought about a refinement in art and architecture, with slender columns, graceful statuary, and narrative reliefs that depicted the pharaoh not just as a god but as a protector, provider, and administrator. Chapter 14: Senusret III and Amenemhat III, the pinnacle of the Middle Kingdom. Senusret III, Pharaoh of Power and Justice. Senusret III is remembered as both a conqueror and reformer. Militarily, he campaigned aggressively in Nubia, building fortresses and launching punitive expeditions. Politically, he diminished the power of hereditary nomarchs, effectively centralizing governance. He is one of the rare kings whose images deviate from standard idealism. His statues show him with deep furrows, sagging cheeks, and a stern expression, a portrayal of the weight of kingship. He wasn't just a divine figure. He was a man bearing the burden of an empire. Amenemhat III, the Golden Pharaoh. Under Amenemhat III, Egypt enjoyed its most prosperous era since the Old Kingdom. His grand engineering projects in the Fayum reclaimed vast tracts of agricultural land, while his labyrinth at Hawara, a mortuary complex with thousands of rooms, astonished later Greek historians. Trade reached new heights. Egypt's ports bustled with goods from Punt, Byblos, and Crete. The Sinai mines were exploited on an unprecedented scale, and records of foreign expeditions filled temple walls. Chapter 15, Decline and Foreign Intrusion, the Second Intermediate Period. Following Amenemhat III, the line of succession faltered. The 13th dynasty saw a rapid turnover in pharaohs, more than 50 kings in less than 2 centuries, signaling instability. Central authority eroded again, and the balance of power shifted. This time, the vacuum invited foreign occupation. The Hyksos, possibly Semitic-speaking traders and settlers from the Levant, took advantage of the chaos. Initially integrated into Delta society, they eventually seized power, establishing their capital at Avaris and inaugurating the 15th dynasty. Though their rule was efficient and pragmatic, they adopted Egyptian customs, titles, and religion. The memory of foreign rule was seared into the Egyptian psyche as a national humiliation. Yet the Hyksos also introduced key innovations. The horse-drawn chariot, new metallurgical techniques, and advanced weaponry, which the Egyptians would later use against them. In the far south, Thebes remained free, governed by the 17th dynasty. Here, the seeds of rebellion grew. A new line of Theban warrior kings would soon rise to cast out the Hyksos and restore Egyptian sovereignty, setting the stage for the empire. Chapter 16, The Rebirth of an Empire. In the shadows of fallen dynasties and amidst the encroachments of foreign rulers, Thebes, the heart of the south, stirred with the pulse of a rising storm. The humiliation of Hyksos rule gnawed at the pride of a people who had once believed themselves to be the sole stewards of Ma'at, the cosmic balance ordained by the gods. In the deep south, beyond the reach of foreign dominion, the ancient spirit of Egypt had not died but waited, cloaked in quiet resolve. It was in this crucible of indignation and longing that a new line of pharaohs emerged, destined not merely to liberate Egypt, but to transform it into an empire of unprecedented scope. The founder of this renaissance was Ahmose, son of Seqenenretau and brother of Kamose, both warrior kings who had begun the resistance against the Hyksos but had died before it could be completed. With Thebes as his stronghold and divine vengeance in his heart, Ahmose led a series of brilliant military campaigns that crushed Hyksos strongholds in the delta and pursued their remnants into southern Canaan. The long-occupied city of Avaris fell, and the foreign yoke was shattered. For the first time in centuries, the two lands were reunited, and Ahmose declared himself ruler of all Egypt, inaugurating the 18th dynasty. Ahmose did not stop at mere liberation. He expanded the military, reorganized the administration, restored temples desecrated by foreign rule, and initiated vast building projects that demonstrated both divine favor and royal authority. He re-established control over Nubia and reopened trade routes to the Red Sea and the Levant. Under his reign, the Egyptian state was reborn, not as a defensively postured kingdom, but as an expansive and aggressive empire in the making. What followed was a golden age. A period of unmatched prosperity, art, architecture, military might, and theological evolution. Egypt no longer looked inward, its gaze now turned to the wide world beyond its deserts and rivers, and it demanded tribute from all it surveyed. Chapter 17, Hatshepsut and the Architecture of Legacy. In the lineage of kings, there arose a ruler whose very existence defied the expectations of her office. Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, wife to Thutmose II, and stepmother to the young Thutmose III, would take hold of Egypt's destiny and inscribe her name among the greatest of pharaohs, not merely as a queen, but as a king in her own right. Her rise was not born of conquest, but of cunning, ceremony, and the slow weaving of religious legitimacy. In a society that had long viewed kingship as an expression of divine masculinity, Hatshepsut's ascent was an extraordinary act of redefinition. Upon the premature death of her husband, the child heir Thutmose III was too young to rule, and Hatshepsut assumed the role of regent. But her role did not remain passive. Over time, she adopted the full trappings of kingship. She appeared in masculine garb, wore the ceremonial false beard, and referred to herself with male pronouns and royal titulary. Yet this was not an attempt to erase her identity, it was an act of synthesis. In her kingship, Hatshepsut fused the masculine authority of the pharaoh with the protective and nurturing aspects of the divine feminine. She presented herself not merely as a ruler, but as the offspring of the god Ammonius himself, born of a divine conception that rivaled myth. Her reign was marked not by war but by splendor, prosperity, and astonishing architectural ambition. Nowhere is her legacy more magnificently displayed than at Deir el-Bahari, where her mortuary temple rises from the cliffs in terraces of grace and symmetry. Designed by her chief architect and rumored confidant Senenmut, the temple became a physical hymn to Ammonius and a statement of her legitimacy. Painted reliefs within depict the famed expedition to the land of Punt, a mythical realm of incense, myrrh trees, and exotic animals, emphasizing her role as provider and divine emissary. Hatshepsut's reign was an age of peace and trade. Egypt's coffers swelled with goods from across the known world. Art and sculpture reached new levels of refinement, and her building campaigns left a permanent mark on temples throughout Upper Egypt. She reinforced the cult of Ammonius, further elevating the god whose favor she claimed and whose priesthood became increasingly powerful under her patronage. While some later kings attempted to erase her name from history, chiseling away her images in an effort to restore a male-dominated succession, her monuments endured, her story resurfaced, and her genius shone through the silence imposed upon her memory. Chapter 18, Thutmose III and the Conquest of the World. In the shadow of Hatshepsut's towering legacy, a boy once groomed in silence emerged to claim his place at the head of the world's most powerful kingdom. Thutmose III, denied the full glory of kingship during his formative years, had watched as Egypt was reshaped by trade and art. But the soul of a warrior beat within him, and when the queen's reign ended, whether by death or maneuver, he stood poised to transform Egypt not merely into a prosperous state, but into a far-reaching imperial force. His reign would span over 5 decades, and in its arc, Egypt would march across deserts and rivers to forge an empire unlike any before it. Thutmose III's early campaigns were swift and decisive. Almost immediately after assuming full control, he embarked on a military expedition northward to quell a coalition of rebellious Canaanite princes who had dared to rise in the vacuum left by Hatshepsut's rule. At Megiddo, in a daring tactical masterstroke, Thutmose led his forces through a narrow mountain pass that his generals had deemed too dangerous. By catching the enemy off guard, he delivered a crushing victory that would echo through time. The siege of Megiddo lasted for 7 months, but its capture solidified Egyptian supremacy in the Levant and opened a floodgate for further conquest. Over the course of 17 known campaigns, Thutmose III pushed Egypt's frontiers deeper into Syria and farther up the Euphrates than any pharaoh before or after him. Cities surrendered, princes swore loyalty, and foreign lands paid tribute in gold, horses, cattle, ivory, and exotic goods. Egypt became not only a military power but a collector of the riches of the world. In these campaigns, Thutmose did not merely destroy, he absorbed. Hostages were brought to Egypt to be educated in the ways of the Nile, ensuring loyalty from their homelands upon their return. His empire was not stitched together by brute force alone, but with shrewd diplomacy and systemic integration. Within Egypt, his reign was a time of order, affluence, and relentless building. Temples were erected, older monuments expanded, and the wealth of empire flowed through Thebes in processions of abundance. Thutmose dedicated vast tributes to Ammonius, the state god, whose temples at Karnak grew ever more opulent. Each military victory was attributed to Ammonius' favor, reinforcing the divine sanction of the king's earthly mission. In stone reliefs and inscriptions, the king is shown in idealized form, smiting enemies beneath his chariot wheels, offering captives to the gods, and striding through vanquished lands like a living deity. Despite his military prowess, Thutmose was not merely a warlord. He had a keen interest in botany and brought back specimens from foreign lands, which he catalogued in temple reliefs. He improved Egypt's administrative system and maintained a close relationship with the priesthood and nobility. Under his rule, the bureaucracy expanded and governance became more sophisticated, laying the groundwork for future kings to maintain control over such an expansive realm. By the time of his death, Thutmose III had earned his place not only as one of Egypt's greatest warrior pharaohs, but as a strategist and ruler who had redefined the very shape of the Egyptian world. His empire stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, a staggering span of influence that no successor would match for generations. The Nile had once defined Egypt. Under Thutmose, it merely served as its spine. He had made Egypt the beating heart of an empire, and in doing so, he had carved his name into the stone of eternity. Chapter 19, Amenhotep III and the dazzling sun of splendor. The reign of Amenhotep III marks one of the most magnificent high points in all of Egyptian history, a time when the land along the Nile glittered not with the sound of war, but with the golden hum of prosperity, ceremony, and an unmatched cultural fluorescence. He inherited the empire when it was already vast, fortified, and rich thanks to the conquests of his forebears. But unlike Thutmose III, Amenhotep did not need to conquer lands to assert Egypt's dominance. His supremacy was unquestioned, his borders secure. What he forged instead was an age of diplomacy, grand architecture, spiritual transformation, and refinement, where kings were worshipped as gods and the court of Thebes became the center of the known world. From the earliest years of his reign, Amenhotep III projected an aura of divine kingship. He emphasized his direct connection to the gods, particularly Ammonius, and portrayed himself not simply as a mortal intermediary but as a living deity upon the throne. He was called the dazzling sun, and his court revolved around him as if orbiting a celestial body. His birth was mythologized in temple reliefs. The god Ammonius himself, in the guise of his earthly father, was said to have impregnated his mother, Queen Mutamwea, creating a child who was god and man entwined. This idea was more than flattery, it was political theology. In an empire as vast as his, divine kingship was not merely symbolic, it was a stabilizing force. One of the most enduring testaments to his reign was his building program, unprecedented in scope and opulence. He commissioned hundreds of monuments, statues, and temples, each grander than the last. Nowhere was this more evident than in Thebes, his capital, where the temple of Luxor rose in golden splendor, dedicated to Ammonius and the king's own divine self. Colossi of himself were erected, most famously the two massive seated statues now known as the Colossi of Memnon, that once flanked the entrance to his mortuary temple, now lost to time and flood. These statues, towering above the plains of Thebes, portrayed Amenhotep not in motion or conquest, but in stillness. Calm, eternal, and unyielding. Under his reign, art reached new heights of sophistication and humanism. Sculptures took on a softness and realism, moving beyond the rigid forms of earlier dynasties. Reliefs and paintings became more fluid, depicting musicians, dancers, flora, and fauna in astonishing detail. The decorative arts flourished, and luxury abounded. Jewelry of lapis and gold, furniture inlaid with ivory, and palaces adorned with faience tiles that shimmered like water under sunlight. His palace at Malkata, on the western bank of the Nile, became a center of opulence and administration, complete with artificial lakes and pleasure gardens. Foreign dignitaries and emissaries marveled at the riches of Egypt, often overwhelmed by the sheer volume of gifts sent from the pharaoh's court. But Amenhotep III was no isolationist. His court was cosmopolitan, open to the wider world. He maintained an active network of diplomatic correspondence with the great powers of the ancient Near East, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittites, through a series of letters now known as the Amarna letters, named for the site where they were discovered. These clay tablets offer a rare glimpse into the political dynamics of the time. Foreign kings addressed Amenhotep as a brother, and sought his favor in the form of marriage alliances and the exchange of luxury goods. Often, they pleaded for gold, Egypt's most precious and abundant resource. In return, Amenhotep received princesses, artisans, rare animals, and exotic commodities, all of which enriched the Egyptian world and affirmed his position as the preeminent ruler of the age. Despite this wealth and grandeur, subtle tremors were beginning to stir beneath the surface. The power of the priesthood of Ammonius had grown vast, fed by centuries of royal patronage. Their economic and spiritual influence rivaled that of the king himself. Meanwhile, Amenhotep's increasing focus on solar iconography, the glorification of the sun god Ra and the symbolism of light, began to shift religious emphasis subtly but decisively. This theological current, gentle in Amenhotep's lifetime, would swell into a tidal wave under his son, changing Egypt in radical and unprecedented ways. As Amenhotep III aged, he was deified in life, worshipped in temples even as he walked the earth. His court grew more insulated, more ceremonial, and more detached from the world outside its gates. Yet to his subjects and foreign admirers alike, he was the living embodiment of divine order, the apex of Egyptian civilization. When he died, after nearly 4 decades of rule, he left behind a kingdom at the zenith of its power, a cultural legacy of shimmering brilliance, and a son who would defy the very gods that had enthroned his dynasty. Chapter 20, Akhenaten and the God of Light. From the shimmering heights of Amenhotep III's golden court emerged a figure who would not simply inherit a kingdom, but attempt to reshape the very soul of Egypt. Amenhotep IV, who would soon rename himself Akhenaten, was unlike any pharaoh before him. Where his father had embodied stability, divine kingship, and harmonious diplomacy, Akhenaten would reject centuries of religious tradition, dismantle the pantheon and enthrone a single god, the Aten, the radiant disk of the sun. His reign was not merely a political or religious deviation, it was a seismic upheaval, a theological revolution that unsettled the very foundations of Egyptian identity. It was a period of astonishing art, fervent devotion, isolation, and eventual collapse. When Amenhotep IV first took the throne, he appeared to continue the rituals of his predecessors. But even in the early years of his reign, signs of divergence emerged. His devotion to the Aten, once a minor aspect of the sun god Ra, became increasingly pronounced. He gradually marginalized the traditional gods, especially Ammonius, whose priesthood had grown immensely powerful during his father's rule. By the 5th year of his reign, he formally broke with tradition. He changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and proclaimed the Aten as the sole true deity. In doing so, he instituted the first known attempt at monotheism in recorded history. The rejection of Egypt's ancient pantheon was not merely theological, it was political. By dismantling the cult of Ammonius, Akhenaten was directly attacking the vast economic and ideological power that the priesthood had accumulated. Temples were closed, idols defaced, names of old gods chiseled out of monuments. In their place, a new iconography emerged, not of anthropomorphic gods, but of the sun disk, whose rays terminated in tiny hands, offering the Ankh, the symbol of life, directly to the king and his family. Akhenaten declared himself and his queen, Nefertiti, as the only intermediaries between Aten and the world, centralizing divine authority in his person and elevating his family to near-divine status. To give this new theology a physical home, Akhenaten abandoned the traditional capitals of Memphis and Thebes and constructed an entirely new city from scratch, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, located at modern-day Amarna. Built at breakneck speed, the city was a vision of religious purity and royal dominance. Temples were roofless, open to the sky so the sun's rays could pour in. Palaces and public buildings were adorned with vibrant frescoes of flowers, birds, and natural life, reflecting a world blessed by Aten's radiance. It was a utopian vision carved from the desert, isolated from the old centers of power. Art during Akhenaten's reign underwent a dramatic transformation. The rigid, idealized forms of traditional Egyptian art gave way to a startling realism. The royal family was depicted with elongated limbs, protruding bellies, and narrow faces. Features that some scholars interpret symbolically. others pathologically, and still others as purely aesthetic. Scenes became more intimate and fluid, the king embracing Nefertiti, children clambering on their laps, moments of affection bathed in sunlight. This shift was not confined to royal portraits. Common scenes of daily life, musicians, workers, priests, were rendered with a dynamism and vitality previously unseen. It was as if the entire kingdom, in this brief moment of divergence, breathed a different artistic air. Yet the utopia of Akhenaten was fragile. While he focused on theology and artistic expression, the outer edges of the empire began to fray. Vassal states in Syria and Canaan sent desperate pleas for aid, recorded in the Amarna letters, as rivals like the Hittites and Mitanni pressed in. But Akhenaten appeared indifferent, his gaze fixed on the Aden, even as the world around him shifted. Egypt's traditional military and diplomatic machinery was left neglected, and resentment grew among those loyal to the old gods. The internal isolationism of his regime, the suppression of cults, the disregard for imperial defense, the economic strains of building a new capital, began to erode the stability inherited from his father. By the time of his death, Akhenaten had ruled for 17 tumultuous years. His legacy was uncertain. His successors, including the mysterious Smenkhare and eventually the boy king Tutankhaten, soon to be Tutankhamun, were left to navigate the chaos he had created. Akhenaten's city would be abandoned, his monuments defaced, his name erased from king lists. It was as though Egypt sought to forget him, to undo the rupture he had made in time. But history remembers. His experiment in monotheism, his radical art, and his vision of a world illuminated by a single, all-powerful sun god remain among the most fascinating and debated episodes in the history of human civilization. Akhenaten had not merely ruled, he had attempted to remake the cosmos. And though his Aten ceased to shine in the temples of Egypt, the echo of his vision still lingers, like the rays of a sun long set. Chapter 21, Tutankhamun and the Return of the Old Gods. As the sun set on Akhenaten's radical vision, Egypt found itself disoriented, fractured by years of theological upheaval, foreign encroachment, and internal neglect. The once unified empire was divided between loyalists to the old gods and remnants of the Aten cult, while vassal states that had long pledged allegiance to the pharaoh now questioned Egypt's strength. Into this delicate, uncertain world stepped a boy, no older than 9. Crowned as the next king of the two lands. Born to Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten, he would become known to history by the name that marked the nation's spiritual restoration, Tutankhamun, the living image of Ammonius. Tutankhamun was the likely son of Akhenaten, possibly by a lesser wife or a secondary queen. Raised during the height of the Amarna experiment, the young king had known only the sun-drenched temples and radical theology of Atenism. But the tides had already begun to turn. The city of Akhetaten had fallen into disfavor, the great court artists and priests of the traditional pantheon quietly re-emerging from exile or silence. The real power in the early years of Tutankhamun's reign lay in the hands of 2 men, a seasoned court official and possibly his maternal grandfather, and Horemheb, a military commander of sharp political instincts. These men steered the boy king toward a dramatic reversal of policy that would become the hallmark of his short life. Early in his reign, the young pharaoh issued a formal decree restoring the ancient religion of Egypt. The temples of Ammonius were reopened, their priests reinstated, and their images recarved on walls where Akhenaten had ordered them defaced. The capital was moved away from Akhetaten back to Memphis and Thebes, reuniting the nation with its ancestral homes of power and piety. The Aten did not disappear completely, but it was relegated once more to a minor aspect of the solar theology, no longer a jealous god demanding exclusivity. Tutankhaten shed his name and adopted Tutankhamun as a signal to the people, a declaration that order had returned and the gods had been appeased. Though still a child, Tutankhamun played the role of divine restorer with surprising grace. His court commissioned statues and inscriptions depicting him making offerings to Ammonius and participating in traditional rites. Temples were refurbished, festivals resumed, and the great gods, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Thoth, once again received daily worship. It was not merely a return to the past, it was a conscious act of healing. Egypt had suffered a trauma to its spiritual core, and the boy king, perhaps more than anyone, embodied the fragile hope that the sacred order of Ma'at, cosmic balance, could be restored. His reign, however, was not without struggle. The external threats that Akhenaten had ignored still loomed. Egypt's influence in Syria and Canaan had waned, and Horemheb was tasked with restoring military order along the fringes of empire. The nation's economy had been strained by years of mismanagement, temple closures, and the cost of building a city in the desert that now stood largely abandoned. Tutankhamun's court focused on stabilizing the state from within, consolidating administrative control, repairing diplomacy, and overseeing a rebirth of artistic expression. Sculptors, painters, and jewelers returned to older forms but infused them with the graceful naturalism born in the Amarna period, creating a hybrid style that reflected both continuity and change. Then, as quietly as he had come, the boy king died, likely in his late teens, under mysterious circumstances. Theories abound: a sudden illness, a tragic accident, or perhaps even foul play. His death stunned the court, for though young, Tutankhamun had become a symbol of restoration, a living vessel for Egypt's cultural rebirth. The preparations for his burial were hurried, the tomb unusually small for a pharaoh, perhaps initially intended for someone else. Yet within it were placed treasures of unimaginable beauty. Gold shrines, statues, jewelry, and the now iconic golden funerary mask that would, millennia later, immortalize his image. Tutankhamun's tomb, untouched for centuries until its discovery in 1922 by Howard Carter, would become the most famous archaeological find in history. Ironically, his legacy, forgotten by ancient scribes and unmentioned in the lists of great kings, would outshine that of far more powerful rulers. But within his brief reign, Tutankhamun had done more than just exist between two great epochs. He had helped close a wound that threatened to unravel the spiritual identity of Egypt itself. In the decades that followed his death, his successors, first I, then Horemheb, would work to further erase the memory of the heretical period, destroying the monuments of Akhenaten, dismantling what remained of Akhetaten, and restoring Egypt to its former orthodoxy. But the echoes of the revolution remained, faint and haunting, like a song once sung to the sun. Tutankhamun had been both the child of a heretic and the vessel of salvation. And though his time was brief, he stood at the crossroads of Egypt's most intimate crisis, a golden thread stitching back together the torn fabric of a nation. Chapter 22, Horemheb and the Restoration of the Realm. The death of Tutankhamun marked not just the passing of a young monarch, but the closing of one of the most turbulent chapters in Egypt's ancient history. As the golden mask of the boy king was lowered into the shadows of the Valley of the Kings, Egypt found itself once again in need of guidance, not from a god-king of divine blood, but from a steady, seasoned hand. That hand belonged to Horemheb, a man of soldierly discipline, administrative shrewdness, and unshakable loyalty to the old order. He had stood in the wings during the ideological firestorm of Akhenaten, weathered the delicate restoration under Tutankhamun, and now, as Egypt teetered between spiritual recovery and political instability, he ascended the throne not by inheritance, but by earned authority. Horemheb had begun his career under Amenhotep III and had risen to prominence as commander-in-chief under Akhenaten, though he seems to have kept a pragmatic distance from the Aten cult's religious extremism. His years of experience in both military and bureaucratic domains gave him unparalleled insight into the inner workings of a fractured kingdom. By the time of Tutankhamun's death, he had already emerged as the true power behind the throne. Though a brief interlude followed under I, the elderly courtier who may have married Tutankhamun's widow to legitimize his own brief rule, it was Horemheb who ultimately claimed the crown, asserting himself as the rightful heir, not by divine birth but by divine necessity. Once enthroned, Horemheb ruled with a firm but revitalizing hand. He understood that Egypt's wounds ran deep, not merely in its temples and tombs, but in the machinery of governance itself. One of his first and most decisive actions was to purge the bureaucracy of corruption and inefficiency. The years of Amarna chaos had seen the erosion of the civil service, with incompetent or ideologically loyal scribes replacing capable administrators. Horemheb issued a sweeping legal code that regulated the judiciary, cracked down on abuses of power, and reinstated a disciplined civil structure. This was not mere housekeeping. It was a fundamental rebuilding of Egypt's moral and administrative backbone. But Horemheb's most enduring legacy was his methodical dismantling of the Amarna heresy. Without excessive cruelty or theatrical vengeance, he erased the memory of Akhenaten and his religious revolution from public record. Temples to Aten were demolished or converted. Akhenaten's name was struck from monuments and king lists, his image defiled or obliterated. Even Tutankhamun, whose reign had sought restoration, was passed over in official records. Horemheb's reign was presented as a direct continuation of Amenhotep III's, a deliberate effort to reconnect Egypt with the last undisputed age of glory and prosperity. In the eyes of posterity, he was to be the bridge, not the successor of heresy, but the rebirth of divine kingship. Militarily, Horemheb turned his attention to Egypt's shrinking empire. The neglect of Akhenaten's foreign policy had emboldened Egypt's enemies and unraveled alliances in the Levant. Horemheb moved quickly to re-establish authority, launching military campaigns into Syria and Palestine to reassert dominance. These were not grand conquests, but strategic actions meant to reinforce Egypt's presence and stem the tide of Hittite influence in the region. He also strengthened garrisons in Nubia, ensuring that Egypt's wealth-generating territories in the south remained secure and loyal. Through these efforts, Horemheb not only restored territorial integrity but reminded both allies and adversaries that Egypt's sword had not grown dull. Culturally, his reign signified a return to orthodoxy, yet not a rejection of artistic evolution. The Amarna style, though politically radioactive, had seeded a more naturalistic and expressive form of art. Horemheb's monuments and statues fused this aesthetic with traditional symmetry and grandeur. His colossal statues bore the weight and poise of pharaonic timelessness, yet their facial features carried a subtle trace of realism, as if the soul of Egypt, scarred and wiser, now looked through older eyes. Curiously, Horemheb left no direct heir. Whether by fate or intention, he appointed his trusted general, Paramesu, as his successor. Paramesu would ascend the throne as Ramses I, inaugurating the 19th dynasty, which would give rise to some of Egypt's most formidable rulers. Horemheb, the last king of the 18th dynasty, thus chose continuity over bloodline, legacy over vanity. He understood that the strength of Egypt resided not in royal descent alone, but in the unbroken thread of Ma'at, the divine balance of order, justice, and truth. When Horemheb died after nearly 3 decades of rule, Egypt was once again whole. The temples were filled with incense and chant, the borders were guarded, and the land flowed with grain. He had been a restorer, a guardian, a master architect of renewal. And though his name would not shine with the mythic splendor of Ramses the Great or Thutmose the Conqueror, his role in preserving the Egyptian world was no less vital. Horemheb had taken a kingdom adrift and anchored it in the bedrock of its own soul. He left no pyramid to pierce the heavens, but his legacy was written in the breath of a civilization that had rediscovered itself. Chapter 23, Ramses I, Seti I, and the Foundations of a New Dynasty. With the death of Horemheb, the great bridge between the chaos of Amarna and the rebirth of tradition, Egypt did not fall into disarray. Instead, it entered a new chapter of stability and ambition under the 19th dynasty. The transition was smooth, almost unusually so for an era when succession disputes were commonplace. That smoothness was the result of Horemheb's foresight. Though he had no children of his own, he made a deliberate and calculated choice. He passed the throne to his trusted general and vizier, a man of wisdom and administrative brilliance named Paramesu, who was crowned pharaoh as Ramses I. Ramses I's reign was brief, perhaps only a year or two, yet his significance should not be underestimated. He was not born into royalty, but into a noble family of military and priestly background in the eastern delta. This lineage gave him both the martial pragmatism and the theological reverence required to steward Egypt through a period of renewal. Ramses I accepted the throne not as a revolutionary but as a continuation of Horemheb's vision. To strengthen the state, restore sacred traditions, and prepare the kingdom for a future of greatness. Though time did not allow him to leave many monuments or inscriptions, he set in motion a dynasty that would define the last golden age of ancient Egypt. More than any act of statecraft, Ramses I's greatest legacy was his son, Seti I, whom he groomed for rule from the moment of his coronation. Seti had already served in high positions as a military commander and prince-regent during his father's short reign, and upon Ramses I's death, he assumed power without conflict or opposition. Seti I ascended the throne with vigor, intelligence, and a vision that reached beyond mere restoration. He would be a builder of empires and a restorer of glory. Seti I was a man who blended reverence for the past with a bold strategy for the future. His name, invoking the god Set, the deity of storms, strength, and foreigners, reflected his martial disposition. Seti's foremost ambition was to reclaim Egypt's authority abroad and elevate its cultural majesty at home. His reign would be defined by both sword and stone, conquest and construction. On the battlefield, Seti wasted no time asserting Egypt's supremacy in the Near East. The years of neglect under Akhenaten had allowed the Hittites to expand their reach, especially into Syria, and many of Egypt's former vassal states had slipped into rebellion or aligned with foreign powers. Seti launched a series of well-organized campaigns into Palestine, Lebanon, and as far north as Kadesh. These campaigns were not just military exercises but public demonstrations of renewed strength. Temple walls across Egypt bore vibrant carvings of the pharaohs smiting enemies and receiving the submission of foreign chieftains. These scenes served as both divine affirmation and political propaganda. Seti was not merely a king, he was the hand of order striking down chaos on the borders of the known world. Yet Seti's ambitions were not confined to the theater of war. At home, he embarked on an extensive building program to rejuvenate Egypt's sacred and civic architecture. In Thebes, he began constructing the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, a colossal forest of stone columns that would become one of Egypt's most awe-inspiring religious monuments. Each pillar, thick and towering, seemed to mimic the sacred papyrus stalks of the Nile, transformed into stone as a testimony to the eternal stability of Ammonius' domain. Seti's building projects extended beyond Karnak. He restored temples desecrated during the Amarna period, erected new shrines in Abydos, and continued the embellishment of Luxor. These efforts were not simply grandiose gestures, they were acts of spiritual healing and national pride. Perhaps his most personal contribution was his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, one of the most beautifully decorated burial chambers ever carved into the Theban cliffs. Unlike the chaotic style of Amarna or the minimalism of Tutankhamun's hurried tomb, Seti's final resting place was a masterpiece of symmetry, color, and sacred text, a gallery of gods, hymns, and cosmic order etched into limestone and painted with loving precision. It reflected a pharaoh deeply committed to his place in the afterlife, as well as his desire to guide the living through his legacy. In administration, Seti I followed in the footsteps of Horemheb by maintaining a strong civil service and military command structure. His reign brought efficiency and discipline to Egypt's bureaucracy, and he upheld the divine laws of Ma'at with seriousness and justice. He revived many of the priesthoods and temples that had been diminished, reinvigorating Egypt's complex network of religious institutions. Under his rule, the priests of Ammonius regained their influence, and the rituals that bound heaven and earth were observed with renewed zeal. Despite his efforts and successes, Seti I understood that his work would not be finished in one lifetime. That understanding manifested in his grooming of his son and co-regent, a prince whose name would become synonymous with grandeur, Ramses II. Seti gave Ramses military experience from a young age, allowing him to lead campaigns, preside over ceremonies, and learn the intricacies of rule. This passing of the torch was done with care and foresight, ensuring that Egypt would not stumble again into chaos upon a pharaoh's death. When Seti I died, he left behind an Egypt restored in power, dignity, and purpose. He had reclaimed foreign lands, resurrected temples, rebuilt the spiritual framework of the state, and laid the foundation for an era of monumental ambition. His reign did not reach the mythic proportions of his sons, but in many ways, it was Seti I who made Ramses II's greatness possible. He was a warrior and a builder, a priest and a king, the embodiment of a nation rediscovering its voice after the silence of heresy. And as the golden sun continued to rise each morning over the Nile, the legacy of Seti I echoed in the chants of priests, the march of soldiers, and the whispers of wind through columns bearing his name. Chapter 24, Ramses the Great, the Living God of Empire. When Seti I departed the mortal world, he left behind more than monuments and military victories. He left a throne poised for glory and a son who would take Egypt to heights it had not seen in generations. That son was Ramses II, the boy who had walked in the shadows of Karnak's columns and marched at his father's side in the heat of foreign wars. He was not just groomed to rule. He was sculpted, chiseled by statecraft, ritual, and warfare into the image of divine kingship. And when he took the throne, Ramses did not merely reign, he transcended. He would become Ramses the Great, a living god whose legacy towered not just over Egypt, but over the very concept of kingship itself. From the earliest days of his reign, Ramses II demonstrated an understanding of both spectacle and substance. His vision was not merely to lead Egypt but to immortalize himself as the greatest pharaoh who had ever lived. He assumed the throne around 1279 BCE and ruled for an astonishing 66 years, one of the longest reigns in all of Egyptian history. In that time, he turned temples into mountains, carved statues of himself that loomed like sentinels over the desert, and inscribed his name across every wall, obelisk, and pylon he could reach. But beneath this grandeur lay the disciplined mind of a king who understood power, how it was displayed, how it was projected, and how it must be enforced on both the battlefield and the papyrus scroll. Ramses began his rule by continuing the military campaigns initiated under his father. He led expeditions into Canaan, Syria, and Nubia, asserting Egypt's presence in contested lands. His most famous confrontation, however, would come against the mighty Hittite Empire at the Battle of Kadesh. One of the most well-documented battles of the ancient world. The clash occurred near the Orontes River in modern-day Syria. It was a colossal engagement, with chariots thundering across the plain and foot soldiers crashing together beneath banners of falcons and lions. Ramses, caught in a moment of tactical surprise, was nearly overwhelmed, but legend, as told by temple reliefs and poetic inscriptions, claims that he fought alone, wielding his bow with divine fury, until reinforcements arrived. While the reality may have been less heroic than the propaganda etched in stone, the significance of Kadesh went beyond tactics. The battle ended in stalemate, but it led to the world's first known peace treaty, a remarkable diplomatic achievement etched in cuneiform and hieroglyphs. It was a recognition that even among gods, negotiation could achieve what bloodshed could not. The treaty with the Hittites not only stabilized Egypt's northern frontier but symbolized Ramses' desire to rule as both warrior and peacemaker, a master of war who understood the necessity of peace. Domestically, Ramses' reign was marked by an explosion of construction unrivaled in scale or ambition. He built with a fervor that had not been seen since the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom. His most iconic creation was the temple complex at Abu Simbel, carved directly into a cliff overlooking the Nile in Nubia. There, four colossal statues of Ramses himself, each over 60 feet high, sat in eternal vigilance, their gazes fixed upon the rising sun. Inside, the temple walls spoke not only of conquest but of divine favor. During specific days of the year, sunlight would penetrate deep into the inner sanctum, illuminating statues of gods. And of Ramses, seated among them, as their equal. Elsewhere, he expanded the temples at Karnak and Luxor, completed his father's constructions, and built the vast mortuary temple of Ramesseum in Thebes. These structures were not just architectural feats, they were declarations of eternity. In every carving, Ramses II appeared victorious, beloved of the gods, striking down foes or receiving blessings. His name, Usermater Setipenra, meaning, the justice of Ra is powerful, chosen of Ra, was inscribed tens of thousands of times across the land. He ensured that no citizen, priest, or foreign envoy could forget who ruled Egypt, not merely a king, but the embodiment of divine order. Yet Ramses' greatness extended beyond his monuments and armies. He was a political mastermind who maintained stability in a vast and diverse empire. His long reign brought an unparalleled period of peace and prosperity to Egypt. Grain stores overflowed, trade with foreign lands flourished, and the temples hummed with ritual life. He fathered over 100 children, married several queens, including the celebrated Nefertari, and elevated his family to near-mythical status. Nefertari, in particular, was honored with her own grand temple at Abu Simbel, where she was depicted alongside the goddess Hathor, a rare elevation for a queen and testament to Ramses' deep affection for her. Though his reign was not without hardship, the challenges of succession, the burden of managing distant territories, and the wear of age upon his body, Ramses endured. He ruled into his 90s, an ancient titan by any standard, long outliving his contemporaries. His death marked not just the end of a reign, but the dimming of an age. Egypt would never again witness such a convergence of longevity, military power, architectural ambition, and cultural renaissance. Ramses the Great was buried in the Valley of the Kings, in a tomb befitting his stature, though his body would later be moved and reburied to protect it from tomb robbers. When modern archaeologists finally uncovered his remains, they found the mummified figure of a man once venerated as a god, his jaw clenched, his arms crossed in eternal vigilance. Yet his true legacy lay not in the bones that time preserved, but in the empire of memory he had built, a legacy carved into the soul of Egypt, written across centuries, echoing through stone. In Ramses, Egypt had not merely found a king. It had found a myth, a symbol of what it could be at its highest expression. A civilization that dared to reach for the eternal. Chapter 25, The Twilight of the 19th Dynasty, Echoes After the Thunder. When Ramses the Great passed into eternity, he left behind a kingdom overflowing with monuments, victories, and a lineage sprawling with princes and princesses. Yet his immense shadow, so magnificently cast across the Nile Valley, proved both a blessing and a burden. The grandeur of his reign was unmatched, but it created an impossible benchmark for those who followed. In the long afterglow of his rule, the throne of Egypt became both a seat of glory and a crucible of instability. The twilight of the 19th dynasty had begun, not with fire and conquest, but with confusion, rivalries, and slow decline. Ramses II was succeeded by his 13th son, Merneptah, a seasoned general who had already served as prince regent during his father's advanced years. Merneptah ascended the throne in his 60s, and although his reign was brief, lasting about a decade, it was marked by capable leadership amid growing threats. Egypt's northern and western frontiers were increasingly strained by incursions from Libyan tribes and a mysterious coalition of invaders remembered as the Sea Peoples. These confederations, coming from the Aegean and possibly the central Mediterranean, brought destruction across the eastern Mediterranean world, toppling cities and kingdoms. Merneptah met this challenge with resolve. In his famous Victory Stele, he recorded a decisive military campaign that defeated the Libyans and their allies, claiming to have slain tens of thousands and scattered the invaders. This stele is also historically significant for its brief, cryptic reference to a people called Israel, the first known mention of that name in Egyptian records. It is a tiny window into a shifting world, where new powers were emerging on the edges of ancient empires. Though victorious in defense, Merneptah's reign did not restore the full vigor of Ramses II's age. The king's death opened the gates to a period of confusion and internal strife. The succession became a tangled contest. A figure named Amenmès appeared, possibly a usurper, who seized control of Upper Egypt for a time, perhaps even ruling concurrently with or in opposition to Merneptah's rightful heir, Seti II. The record is unclear, muddied by erasures, defaced cartouches, and broken statues. What is clear is that Egypt's throne was no longer secure, it had become a prize to be contested, rather than an institution revered and obeyed. Seti II, once he regained full control, attempted to stabilize the realm, but his rule was short and his authority weak. The power of the priesthoods, especially those at Thebes, began to swell as the pharaohs grew weaker. Provincial administrators and military officials accumulated local power, while the central government struggled to assert itself. It was a slow decentralization, a quiet erosion of unity beneath the grand facades of temples and palaces. After Seti II's death, the succession descended further into uncertainty. A child king named Siptah came to the throne, likely manipulated by a powerful and enigmatic figure, Bey, a court official of foreign origin who rose to astonishing prominence. Bey, once a royal scribe, ascended to the heights of influence, even boasting that he made the king himself. Such a claim was almost heretical in a world where pharaohs were gods, and it revealed just how far the divine kingship had declined. Bey was later executed, perhaps as a scapegoat or due to palace rivalries, but his meteoric rise reflected the shifting nature of power in Egypt's court. During this time, Queen Tuzret, the widow of Seti II and stepmother of Siptah, claimed the throne in her own right. She ruled as pharaoh, adopting full regalia and titles of kingship. Tuzret was a capable and ambitious ruler, commissioning building projects and maintaining ritual observance. However, her reign too ended in uncertainty, and possibly violence. Civil war or rebellion may have marked her final days, but the records are scant, and much of her legacy was later erased. Into this maelstrom stepped Setnacht, a man whose origins remain mysterious. He declared himself the founder of a new line, the 20th dynasty, and claimed to have restored order after chaos. Whether he was a distant royal relative, a military strongman, or a regional governor is still debated by scholars. What is certain is that by the time he took power, the 19th dynasty had collapsed under the weight of succession crises, eroded central authority, and increasing external threats. Yet, this decline was not a fall into barbarism or ruin. The end of the 19th dynasty was a slow dimming rather than a dramatic collapse. Egypt still possessed wealth, temples still rang with hymns to the gods, and scribes still chronicled the deeds of kings, even if those deeds grew fewer and less glorious. The monumental cities remained, the rituals continued, but something essential had shifted. The unity and vigor that Ramses II had projected had fractured. The pharaoh was no longer the unchallenged sun at the center of the Egyptian universe. And so the 19th dynasty, which had begun with restoration and reached its zenith in imperial brilliance, ended in uncertainty and fragmentation. It was a dynasty of bold builders and brilliant warriors, of towering monuments and storied battles. But its final chapters remind us that even the mightiest of reigns cast long, complicated shadows. In the distance, the desert winds whispered of a new age, and on the horizon, the name of a new pharaoh would soon rise. A man who would once more bear the name Ramses, and who would face the greatest migration and invasion that the Mediterranean world had yet seen. Chapter 26, Ramses III, the last pharaoh of empire. As the sands of Egypt shifted into a new century, they bore witness to the rise of a figure who would become the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom, a man who fought to resurrect the glories of the past, to hold back the tides of chaos crashing upon Egypt's shores. That man was Ramses III, the second of his name but, in many ways, the last of his kind. His reign would echo the grandeur of Ramses the Great, but also reflect the fragility of an empire struggling to preserve itself against overwhelming odds. It was a reign of resistance, of final brilliance before twilight, a reign poised on the edge of history's turning blade. Ramses III came to power following the brief rule of his father, Setnacht, who had seized the throne amid the confusion at the end of the 19th dynasty. Setnacht's origins remain mysterious, but his brief reign restored order and established a new royal house, the 20th dynasty. Ramses III, inheriting both the legitimacy of a stabilizing throne and the legacy of imperial Egypt, presented himself as a new Ramses the Great, adopting the regalia, the language, and the iconography of divine kingship in its fullest form. He reigned for over 30 years, and in that time, he would stand as Egypt's last true warrior pharaoh. Early in his reign, Ramses III faced the gravest challenge Egypt had seen since the Hyksos centuries earlier. Entire civilizations around the eastern Mediterranean were collapsing. Mycenaean Greece was falling into ruin, the Hittite Empire had vanished from the records, and cities in Canaan and Syria were being sacked, burned, and abandoned. The agents of this destruction were collectively known as the Sea Peoples, a confederation of seafaring warriors from the Aegean, Anatolia, and the central Mediterranean, whose exact origins remain the subject of debate but whose impact on history was devastating. These were not mere raiders. They were entire migrating societies, armed for war and accompanied by their families, livestock, and ships. They overwhelmed everything in their path. And now, they turned toward Egypt, the last standing bastion of the Bronze Age. Ramses III, forewarned and formidable, prepared his defenses with the vigilance of a seasoned general. He organized both land and naval forces, fortified Egypt's northern borders, and coordinated with regional vassals to monitor enemy movements. When the Sea Peoples finally arrived, in a campaign dated to the 8th year of his reign, they were met not with chaos, but with calculated Egyptian resistance. The decisive confrontation came in what would later be immortalized in wall reliefs at Medinet Habu, Ramses III's mortuary temple in Thebes. There, with vivid imagery and long inscriptions, the king commemorated his victory. The Sea Peoples attacked both by sea and land, but Ramses' naval fleet ambushed their ships in the Nile Delta, trapping them and raining missiles from both ships and archers stationed on the shores. At the same time, Egyptian infantry decimated the invading ground forces. The Sea Peoples were annihilated, many slain, others captured and resettled in Egyptian territory under tight control. This was Egypt's last great military triumph. Ramses III had done what the mighty empires of Anatolia and the Levant could not: he had survived the onslaught. His victory preserved Egypt from the widespread devastation that obliterated its neighbors. The reliefs at Medinet Habu remain among the most extraordinary visual records of ancient warfare, a defiant statement that Egypt still stood, battered, but unbowed. In the years that followed, Ramses III continued to govern with firm authority. He commissioned building projects, restored temples, and reinforced Egypt's borders. He maintained the traditions of ritual kingship, ensuring that offerings flowed to the gods, especially to Ammonius at Karnak. His reign, though besieged by threats, radiated a kind of state-sponsored splendor meant to assure the people that the world remained in cosmic balance, that Ma'at, the divine order, still held. But the reality behind the facades was increasingly strained. The wars had depleted the treasury. Grain shortages began to affect the land, and economic pressures mounted. The power of the priesthoods, especially at Thebes, grew exponentially as religious institutions became economic centers in their own right. The temples were wealthy, vast landholders, often operating independently of the state, and this imbalance would come to haunt later rulers. Then, in the later years of Ramses III's reign, a momentous and disturbing event occurred. The first recorded labor strike in history. Workers at the royal necropolis in Deir el-Medina, responsible for constructing the king's tombs in the Valley of the Kings, stopped working and staged a protest. They had not received their rations, payment in bread, beer, and food, and their families were starving. This event, carefully recorded in surviving ostraca and papyri, revealed the deep fissures running through Egypt's economic foundations. Even amid the glory of Ramses' reign, the old systems were beginning to crack. But perhaps most unsettling was what awaited the pharaoh himself. After a long and dignified reign, Ramses III was the target of a conspiracy, a harem plot, orchestrated from within the royal court. His secondary queen, Tai, conspired to assassinate him in order to place her son, Pentar, on the throne. The plan involved high-ranking officials, palace women, and even members of the judiciary. It was a plot born of ambition, envy, and desperation. And though it was ultimately foiled, evidence suggests that Ramses III did not survive the attempt. Medical analysis of his mummy, conducted thousands of years later, revealed a deep cut to his throat, a fatal wound. He had been murdered, likely by a blade wielded in silence behind the palace walls. His death was hidden by court officials, and his son, Ramses IV, assumed the throne while covering up the circumstances of his father's demise. The conspirators were tried and punished, some forced to commit suicide, others executed, but the damage had been done. Egypt's last great pharaoh had fallen not on the battlefield, but to internal betrayal. Ramses III was buried in the Valley of the Kings, in Tomb KV-11, beneath painted ceilings and solemn prayers. But even in death, his grandeur endured. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu still stands today, massive, magnificent, and defiant. Its walls tell of battles won, enemies crushed, and divine favor received. But they do not tell of economic breakdown, courtly intrigue, or assassins' blades. The reign of Ramses III marked the final echo of New Kingdom majesty. He had fought valiantly to preserve what had been built over centuries: the temples, the gods, the rituals, the throne itself. And for a time, he succeeded. But the tides of history were inexorable. After him, the 20th dynasty would stumble into decline, ruled by a succession of increasingly ineffectual kings, most of whom bore the name Ramses but none of whom bore the might. Egypt would never again project power across Asia as it once had. The age of warrior kings was gone. What remained was memory, of stone, of scroll, of divine legacy. And as the Nile continued to flow, so too did time, ushering Egypt into its final great age before the darkness of fragmentation and foreign domination. Chapter 27, The Long Dusk, Decline of the 20th Dynasty. In the wake of Ramses III's reign, Egypt stood exhausted but unbroken, scarred but still adorned in its ancient pride. The sea peoples had been repelled, the temples remained filled with incense and chants, and the pharaoh still bore the crown of divine kingship. Yet beneath the gilded rituals and monumental stones, the vital energies that had once propelled Egypt into empire had begun to fade. The 20th dynasty, though continuing in name, slowly decayed into a morass of inertia, weakened rule, and internal fragmentation. What followed Ramses III was not a collapse, but a long dusk, an era in which the structures of glory lingered like shadows at twilight, slowly lengthening until the light disappeared altogether. Ramses IV, the son of Ramses III and heir to a blood-stained throne, inherited a kingdom in need of revival. He began his reign with ambition, issuing grand proclamations and initiating building projects that sought to echo the mighty deeds of his father and forebears. Among his first actions was to honor his father's legacy by recording the infamous harem conspiracy trial in detail, a document now known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, ensuring that the betrayal would not be forgotten and that justice, at least in name, had been served. But Ramses IV's aspirations far exceeded the resources available to him. He launched an enormous quarrying expedition to the Wadi Hammamat in the eastern desert, sending thousands of workers to extract stone for new monuments. This endeavor, while impressive in scale, placed a tremendous strain on the state's already fragile logistics. He continued temple constructions, particularly at the great complex of Karnak, and ordered the decoration of tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Yet his reign lasted only 6 or 7 years, and much of what he envisioned remained incomplete. Like a candle lit in a room full of wind, his efforts flickered but could not hold. Ramses V followed, and with him came a new era not of construction, but of documentation. His reign, though brief and largely unremarkable in political terms, left behind some of the most valuable administrative records in ancient Egyptian history. Namely the Wilbur Papyrus, an extensive land survey listing properties, taxes, and temples across Middle Egypt. This document, compiled by scribes of the state, reveals a country increasingly dominated by temple estates, especially those of Ammonius at Thebes. The priesthood's wealth and influence had grown unchecked. Temples owned vast tracts of land, employed thousands, and operated with economic independence that rivaled royal authority. This rise of the Ammonius priesthood, especially the high priests of Ammonius in Thebes, was not merely an economic phenomenon. It had profound political implications. The high priest was not just a religious leader but increasingly a de facto ruler of southern Egypt. The state's spiritual and material centers had grown apart. The pharaoh nominally ruled from the delta in the north, while the real machinery of wealth and local governance lay in the hands of temple officials in the south. Under Ramses VI, this bifurcation deepened. The state became more fragmented, its borders less secure, and its foreign influence virtually non-existent. Tomb robberies, once a capital offense, became rampant, even involving officials meant to guard the royal dead. Ramses VI himself took over the tomb of his predecessor Ramses V, perhaps due to space constraints or economic limitations. His own tomb, KV9 in the Valley of the Kings, is a stunning monument to the persistence of divine kingship in ritual and art, even as the reality of royal power dwindled. Elaborate cosmological texts line its walls, detailing the pharaoh's journey through the underworld. It is a statement of belief